In the criminal underworld of Chicago, blood is the only currency that matters, and vulnerability is a death sentence. But what happens when the city's most ruthless syndicate boss loses the one thing tethering him to his humanity? A 6-year-old girl vanishes into the rainy night during a bloody ambush, sparking a manhunt that threatens to burn the city to ashes. Enter an exhausted ER nurse who finds a shivering child in a dark alley and makes a choice that seals her fate. She didn't just bring a lost girl home, she walked straight into the devil's den, and in doing so, accidentally claimed the devil's heart. The neon signs of the South Side flickered against the wet pavement, casting a bloody, distorted glow over the streets. Clara Hayes pulled her trench coat tighter around her shoulders, the biting November wind slicing right through the thin fabric. She had just finished a brutal 14-hour shift at Street Jude's emergency room, a place where the city's worst secrets bled out onto the linoleum floors. Clara was 27, running on black coffee and sheer willpower, a woman who minded her own business because, in this part of Chicago, curiosity usually ended in a coroner's bag. It was 3:15 a.m. The streets were desolate, save for the occasional rumble of an L train overhead. Clara took her usual shortcut through the narrow alley behind an abandoned textile factory. It was a risky route, but the fatigue deep in her bones demanded the quickest path to her cramped apartment. Halfway down the alley, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks. It wasn't the scuttle of a rat or the groan of settling brick. It was a whimper, a small, ragged sound, barely audible over the drumming rain. Clara froze, her hand instinctively gripping the pepper spray in her pocket. She debated walking away. The cardinal rule of the South Side was to never investigate a noise in the dark, but the whimper came again, followed by a violent sneeze. It sounded heartbreakingly small. Against her better judgment, Clara clicked on her phone's flashlight and swept the beam toward the rusted dumpsters. Tucked in the narrow space between the brick wall and a pile of discarded cardboard was a child. Clara's breath hitched. She dropped to her knees, heedless of the filthy puddles soaking through her jeans. "Hey," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "Hey there, sweetheart, it's okay." The little girl flinched, curling into a tighter ball. She couldn't have been older than 6. She was dressed in what looked like a velvet party dress, now torn and caked in mud, and something dark that Clara's trained eyes immediately recognized as dried blood. The child was clutching a ruined stuffed rabbit, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. "Are you hurt?" Clara asked, slowly reaching out to check for injuries. The little girl stared at her with wide, terrified brown eyes. She didn't speak. She just shook her head frantically. Clara noticed the heavy platinum chain around the girl's neck. A heavy pendant hung from it, shaped like a hawk with its wings spread over a dagger. It was a custom piece, incredibly expensive, entirely out of place in a gutter. "Where are your parents?" Clara asked gently. The girl just buried her face in her muddy knees. She was in deep shock. Clara's instinct was to call 911. She reached for her phone, but as her thumb hovered over the keypad, a memory flashed in her mind. Her older brother Arthur, a decorated detective in the Chicago PD, sitting at her kitchen table, drunk and laughing about how the entire precinct was on the payroll of the Romano crime family. You find something on the streets that don't belong to you, Clara, you leave it. Because the cops won't help you. They'll just sell the information to the highest bidder. If this girl belonged to someone wealthy, and the jewelry said she did, and she was covered in someone else's blood, the police might not be her safest bet. Not in this city. Not tonight. "Okay," Clara breathed, making a split-second decision that would alter the course of her life forever. "Okay, you're freezing. I live 2 blocks away. You're going to come with me, get warm, and we'll figure this out. I'm a nurse. I help people." Clara extended her hand. For a long, agonizing moment, the girl just stared at it. Then, with trembling fingers, she reached out and grabbed Clara's hand. The walk to Clara's apartment was a blur. Once inside the safety of her triple-locked door, Clara stripped the filthy clothes off the little girl, running a warm bath. The blood on the dress wasn't hers. The child was completely uninjured, save for a few scrapes. Clara wrapped her in an oversized fleece sweater and made a bowl of instant oatmeal. The girl ate it ravenously, still not uttering a single word. "I'm Clara," she said, sitting across from the child at the small kitchen table. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl looked up, her dark eyes solemn. She pointed a small clean finger to the heavy platinum pendant she had refused to take off. Clara leaned in. Engraved on the back of the hawk, in elegant, sharp cursive, were 3 letters. Meishe, E. Ah. Mia, Clara whispered. The little girl gave a microscopic nod. Okay, Mia, Clara said, her mind racing. You're safe here tonight. Tomorrow, I'm going to help you find your family. But as Clara tucked Mia into her bed and pulled a blanket over her, a deep sense of dread settled in her stomach. She had seen the news earlier that evening. A massive shootout at a high-end Italian restaurant downtown. Several dead. The newscasters had been frantic, whispering rumors of a Mafia turf war erupting. Clara looked at the sleeping child, then down at the ruined, blood-soaked velvet dress in her bathroom sink. She had a terrifying suspicion that little Mia wasn't just a lost child. She was the epicenter of a war. Across the city, in a sprawling, fortress-like estate on the Gold Coast, hell had frozen over. Dominic Rossi stood in the center of his father's mahogany-paneled library, his knuckles bruised and bleeding, his tailored suit completely ruined. At 32, Dominic was the youngest head of the Rossi syndicate in the family's history. He was a man carved from ice and violence, respected for his brilliant, tactical mind, and feared for his utter lack of mercy. But tonight, the ice had shattered. Find her. Dominic's voice was a low, terrifying rasp. He stared at the 4 capos standing before him, men who had killed without hesitation, yet they were currently sweating under his gaze. Tear the city apart, brick by brick, door by door. If she is not back in this house by sunrise, I will put a bullet in each of your heads myself. His men nodded frantically, backing out of the room to execute his orders. Dominic collapsed into a leather armchair, burying his face in his hands. His chest heaved with a panic he hadn't felt since he was 18, the night his parents were gunned down in their driveway. They had died holding hands, leaving Dominic to raise his newborn sister Mia. Mia was everything. She was the only pure thing left in his blood-soaked world. She was sweet, selectively mute since a bad scare 2 years ago, and fiercely attached to her older brother. Tonight, Dominic had taken her to what was supposed to be a secure, private family dinner at their restaurant. He had stepped away to take a call, 2 minutes. That was all it took for Silas Romano's men to breach the kitchen, guns blazing. Dominic had slaughtered 4 men with his own hands to get to the dining room, but when he arrived, the table was splintered, his bodyguards were dead, and Mia was gone. Dominic. He looked up. Standing in the doorway was his right-hand man, Paulie. We interrogated the survivor from the Romano crew, Paulie said, his voice grim. He swore they didn't take her. They tried. But during the firefight, the girl slipped out the back service door into the alley. She ran. They lost her in the storm. Dominic's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. She was out there, in the freezing rain, alone. Call the police commissioner, Dominic ordered, standing up, his eyes dead and hollow. Tell him I am offering a $2 million bounty for any information. Cash, no questions asked. But if any of those dirty cops touch a hair on her head, I will butcher them. Meanwhile, as the sun began to rise over the dreary skyline, Clara was sitting at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen. She hadn't slept a wink. After ensuring Mia was deeply asleep, Clara had opened her laptop and searched for the hawk and dagger crest. It hadn't taken long. It was the infamous crest of the Rossi family, and the news was currently saturated with breaking alerts. Shooting at Rossi-owned restaurant. Rumors of a high-value kidnapping. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked toward the bedroom. The sweet, silent little girl clutching a ruined rabbit was Mia Rossi, sister to Dominic Rossi, the most dangerous man in the Midwest. Clara's phone buzzed on the table. It was her brother Arthur. She answered it cautiously. Clara, Arthur's voice was tense, breathless. Where are you? I'm at home, Artie. I just got off shift. Why? Listen to me very carefully. Do not leave your apartment today. The streets are tearing themselves apart. Rossi's men are turning the South Side upside down looking for the boss's kid. The Romanos are paying the precinct a fortune to find the kid first to use as leverage. It's a bloodbath out here. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs. The police are looking for her to hand her over to the rival family? Yeah, Arthur scoffed darkly. It's a $2 million bounty from Rossi, but Romano is offering $5 million to whoever brings the kid to his warehouse. We're cops, Clara. We go where the pension is fattest. Just stay inside. He hung up. Clara stared at the wall, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. She couldn't call the police. She couldn't trust Arthur. If anyone found out she had Mia, the Romanos would kick her door down, kill her, and take the girl. She had only one option. A suicidal, insane option. She had to take the girl directly to the Rossi estate. She walked into the bedroom. Mia was awake, sitting up in the oversized sweater, looking out the window. "Mia," Clara said softly, packing her pepper spray, a heavy Maglite flashlight, and a first aid kit into her tote bag. "We have to go for a ride. I'm taking you home to your brother." At the word brother, Mia's eyes lit up with a desperate, frantic hope. She scrambled out of bed, grabbing Clara's hand tightly. Clara bundled the girl into her battered Honda Civic. She didn't have a car seat, so she strapped Mia tightly into the passenger seat, throwing a large blanket over her to hide her from view. As Clara navigated the morning traffic, she saw black SUVs crawling through the streets, men in suits stepping out and shaking down shop owners. The city was under siege. Clara's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. She was a civilian, a nurse. She spent her life fixing broken things, not walking into the crossfire of Mafia wars. But she looked at the little girl beside her who was holding her hand with a terrifying amount of trust. "I've got you," Clara whispered, more to herself than to Mia. "I've got you." The Rossi estate was located on a secluded stretch of the Gold Coast, surrounded by a 10-foot-high wrought iron fence topped with security spikes. As Clara's beat-up Honda pulled up to the massive iron gates, she felt like she was driving a toy car into a military base. There were at least a dozen armed men patrolling the perimeter. The moment Clara's car stopped, 3 men in dark suits, holding assault rifles, stepped out from the guardhouse, blocking her path. Clara shifted the car into park. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unbuckle her seatbelt. "Stay here, sweetie. Keep the blanket over your head," Clara instructed. Mia nodded, pulling the fleece over her face. Clara stepped out of the car into the cold morning air. Instantly, 3 rifles were pointed at her chest. "Lost, lady?" one of the guards barked, his eyes scanning her up and down. "Turn the car around. Now." "I'm not lost," Clara said, her voice trembling but surprisingly loud. "I need to see Dominic Rossi." The guards laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Yeah, you and the FBI. Get in the car and leave before we make you leave." "Tell him," Clara said, taking a step forward, ignoring the guns, "that I found something with a hawk and a dagger on it, in an alley on the south side. Tell him it has the letters MIA on it." The laughter stopped instantly. The silence that fell over the men was thick and suffocating. The lead guard stared at Clara, his face draining of color. He pressed an earpiece into his ear and spoke rapidly in Italian. A minute later, the heavy iron gates slowly groaned open. "Drive it in," the guard ordered. His tone completely shifted. It was no longer mocking, it was deadly serious. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Clara got back in the car. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribcage. She drove up the sweeping, manicured driveway, stopping in front of a massive limestone mansion. Before she could even turn off the engine, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion were thrown open. Dominic Rossi walked out. Clara had seen pictures of him in the local gossip columns, but none of them did justice to the man in person. He was tall, broad-shouldered, radiating an aura of absolute authority and barely contained violence. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal dark ink snaking up his forearms. His face was a masterpiece of sharp angles, but his dark eyes were bloodshot, wild, and utterly terrifying. He marched down the steps, followed by a half-dozen heavily armed men. Clara scrambled out of the car, throwing her hands up defensively. "I have her," she yelled, her voice cracking. "She's safe. She's unhurt." Dominic didn't even look at Clara. He lunged toward the passenger side of the Honda, tearing the door open. Clara watched as the ruthless Mafia boss dropped to his knees on the gravel driveway. He pulled the blanket back. Mia let out a sound, a cross between a sob and a squeak. She launched herself out of the car and into Dominic's arms. Dominic caught her, burying his face in her small neck, wrapping his massive arms around her, as if trying to shield her from the rest of the world. He was shaking. The men standing around the driveway respectfully lowered their weapons and averted their eyes, giving their boss a moment of vulnerability. Clara stood by the hood of her car, suddenly feeling entirely out of place. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was crashing, leaving her dizzy and exhausted. She had done it. She had saved the girl. She turned back toward the driver's seat. I'll be going now." "Stop." The voice cracked through the cold air like a whip. Clara Froze. Dominic slowly stood up, holding Mia securely on his hip. The little girl had her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. Dominic turned his gaze to Clara. The wild panic in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity that made Clara want to shrink into the ground. He walked slowly around the front of the car, stopping 3 feet away from her. He towered over her, his presence suffocating. He analyzed her, her cheap coat, the dark circles under her eyes, the mud stained on the knees of her jeans. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Clara Hayes. I'm a nurse at St. Jude's." She swallowed hard, trying to maintain eye contact. "I found her in an alley behind my apartment. She was freezing. I took her home, cleaned her up, and brought her here." "Why didn't you call the police?" Dominic asked, his eyes narrowing. "There is a $2 million reward. You could have made a phone call and been set for life." Clara let out a bitter, exhausted scoff. "Because I'm not an idiot, Mr. Rossi. I know the Romano family is paying the cops double to hand her over to them. If I gave her to the police, she would be dead, or worse." Dominic's expression flickered. A flash of surprise, followed by something dangerously close to respect. "You brought the most hunted person in the city to my front door, past rival gangs and dirty cops, in a beat-up Honda." "I guess I did." Clara took a step back. "She's safe now. That's all I wanted. I'll leave." She reached for the door handle. Before her fingers could brush the metal, a large, calloused hand slammed against the car door, holding it shut. Clara gasped, looking up into Dominic's dark, fathomless eyes. "You're not going anywhere, Miss Hayes," Dominic said quietly, leaning in so close she could smell the expensive cologne and the metallic tang of dried blood on his skin. "You know about the Romanos. You know about the dirty cops. You know the layout of my security. And most importantly, you know what my sister looks like." "I won't tell anyone," Clara said, panic rising in her throat. "I just wanted to help." "I believe you," Dominic said smoothly, his gaze dropping briefly to her trembling lips before meeting her eyes again. "And for saving my sister's life, I owe you a debt I can never fully repay. But you just stepped out of your civilian life and into the middle of a war zone. If the Romanos or the cops find out it was you who ruined their leverage, they will skin you alive to get to me." He stepped back, gesturing to his men. "Take her car to the underground garage. Take Miss Hayes's belongings to the East Wing guest suite." "Wait, what?" Clara protested, her heart hammering. "You can't keep me here. I have a job. I have a life." Dominic adjusted Mia on his hip, his face a mask of stone. "Your old life ended the moment you picked up my sister from that alley. Welcome to the family, Clara. You belong to me now." The East Wing guest suite of the Rossi estate was larger than Clara's entire apartment building. It was a masterclass in suffocating luxury, heavy silk drapes that blocked out the Chicago skyline, a sprawling 4-poster bed draped in Egyptian cotton, and a marble ensuite bathroom that looked like it belonged in a 5-star hotel. But as Clara paced the length of the Persian rug, all she saw were the reinforced glass windows and the subtle, heavy click of the lock when the guards had shut the door behind her. She was a prisoner, a very comfortable, very terrified prisoner. 2 hours had passed since Dominic Rossi had essentially kidnapped her in his driveway. Her scrubs, stiff with dried mud and rain, had been replaced by a set of incredibly soft, designer loungewear someone had left on the bed. Her battered tote bag sat on an armchair, looking utterly pathetic against the mahogany furniture. A soft knock interrupted her frantic pacing. "Clara Froze." "Yes?" The heavy oak door swung open. It wasn't a guard, nor was it the towering, terrifying figure of Dominic. It was Mia. The little girl had been scrubbed clean, her dark hair brushed into 2 neat braids. She wore a pristine pink sweater and jeans, and in her arms, she clutched a brand-new, terrifyingly expensive-looking porcelain doll. She stepped into the room, her large brown eyes fixing on Clara, and offered a shy, close-mouthed smile. Clara felt the tension drain from her shoulders. She sank to her knees, so she was at eye level with the child. "Hey, Mia, you look much warmer." Mia nodded. She walked forward and held out her hand. Resting in her small palm was a slightly crushed, foil-wrapped chocolate, a peace offering. "Thank you, sweetheart," Clara whispered, taking the chocolate. "Is your brother busy?" Right on cue, a shadow fell over the doorway. I am never too busy for her, Dominic's voice rumbled, sending a shiver straight down Clara's spine. He stepped into the room, having shed the ruined suit jacket. He wore a fitted black dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, highlighting the dark, swirling tattoos that crept up his neck. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. He didn't just enter a room, he consumed the oxygen in it. Mia immediately ran to him, wrapping her arms around his long legs. Dominic's expression softened instantly. The cold, dead-eyed mob boss vanished, replaced by a fiercely protective older brother. He rested a heavy hand on her head, smoothing her hair. "Polly has your favorite cartoons on. In the screening room, Piccola," Dominic murmured to her. "Go. I need to speak with our guest." Mia looked between Clara and her brother, gave a small nod, and darted down the hallway. The moment she was gone, the temperature in the room plummeted. Dominic stepped fully inside, closing the heavy door behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Sit down, Miss Hayes," Dominic commanded, gesturing to a velvet sofa. "I prefer to stand," Clara shot back, lifting her chin. She was a trauma nurse. She dealt with arrogant, screaming surgeons every day. She refused to let this man see how badly her hands were shaking. "I want my phone. I need to call my hospital. If I don't show up for my shift tonight, they'll call the police." Dominic walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured himself a glass of amber liquid. "Your hospital has already been notified. A man claiming to be your uncle called Human Resources an hour ago. He informed them you had a severe family emergency out of state and would be taking an indefinite leave of absence." Clara stared at him, her stomach dropping. You can't do that." "I can, and I did." Dominic took a slow sip of his drink, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "Furthermore, your landlord has been contacted. Your lease is broken. My men are currently packing up your apartment. Your belongings will be placed in secure storage, though a few essentials will be brought here." "Are you insane?" Clara shouted, the sheer audacity of his actions breaking her composure. "You can't just erase my life. I saved your sister. I am not one of your soldiers, and I am not a piece of property you can just lock away." Dominic closed the distance between them in 3 long predatory strides. Clara backed up until her spine hit the cool wall. He planted one hand on the wall beside her head, trapping her. He smelled of rich espresso, gun oil, and danger. "Listen to me very carefully, Clara," he said, his voice a lethal whisper. "Silas Romano lost 4 men last night. He lost the leverage he needed to take over the South Side docks. He is currently tearing the city apart looking for the Good Samaritan who ruined his coup. If you go back to your life, you are a dead woman. They will find you, they will torture you to find out what you told me, and then they will kill you." He leaned in closer, his gaze dropping to her trembling lips before snapping back to her eyes. "I am not keeping you here to punish you. I am keeping you here because it is the only way I can guarantee you keep breathing. You saved the only thing in this world I care about. That makes you under my protection." "I don't want your protection," Clara gasped, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "I want my life back." "Your life is gone," Dominic stated flatly, stepping back and breaking the suffocating proximity. "Adjust to your new one. You have the run of the estate, save for the basement and my private office. If you try to run, my men will catch you. If you somehow make it past the gates, the Romanos will catch you. Choose your cage wisely, Miss Hayes." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Clara alone in the deafening silence of her gilded prison. The 15th precinct was a madhouse. Telephones rang incessantly, uniforms shouted over the din, and the smell of stale coffee and cheap aftershave hung thick in the air. Detective Arthur Hayes sat at his cramped desk, rubbing his temples. He was 34, with the same sharp jawline as his sister Clara, but where her eyes were bright and empathetic, Arthur's were shadowed by years of moral compromises. He was a good cop who had made a series of very bad choices to pay off gambling debts, and now he belonged to Silas Romano body and soul. "Hayes." Arthur looked up as his captain, a bloated man named Miller, who was equally deep in Romano's pocket, slammed a file onto his desk. "Romano is losing his mind," Miller hissed, leaning in close so the honest cops in the bullpen couldn't hear. "Rossi's kid vanished into thin air. Romano's men didn't get her, and Rossi's men are tearing up the streets looking for her. We need to find that little girl before Rossi does, or Romano is going to start leaving body parts on the steps of City Hall. I've got feelers out. Arthur muttered, opening the file. It contained crime scene photos from the Rossi restaurant. A total bloodbath. If she's on the streets, she won't last long in this weather. Someone probably took her in. Then find out who, Miller snapped. Romano bumped the bounty to $5 million. You find that kid, Hayes, and all your debts are wiped clean. Arthur nodded, swallowing hard. $5 million. It was enough to get him out of Chicago. Enough to set him and Clara up somewhere safe, far away from the syndicates. Thinking of Clara, Arthur pulled out his cell phone. He had warned her to stay inside, but she had a stubborn streak a mile wide. He dialed her number. We're sorry. The number you have reached is no longer in service. Arthur frowned. He pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen. He redialed. The same automated message played. A cold prickle of unease washed over him. Clara never turned her phone off, not with her crazy hospital hours. He quickly dialed Street Jude's emergency department and asked for the charge nurse. Brenda? It's Artie Hayes, Clara's brother. Is she on shift today? Oh, Detective Hayes. No, she's not, Brenda's voice came through the receiver, sounding confused. Didn't your uncle tell you? He called this morning. Said there was a family emergency and Clara had to leave the state immediately. We took her off the schedule. Arthur's blood ran ice cold. My uncle? They didn't have an uncle. Their father had been an only child, and their mother was a runaway who died when Clara was 10. Yeah, Brenda, right. Must have slipped my mind. Thanks. Arthur hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of the precinct, ignoring Miller shouting after him. He drove his unmarked cruiser like a madman through the slick Chicago streets, tires squealing, as he took the corner onto Clara's Street on the south side. He pulled up to her apartment building and slammed the car into park, but as he reached for the door handle, he froze. Parked illegally in front of Clara's building was a sleek black Mercedes van. Two men in dark tailored suits were carrying heavy cardboard boxes out of the building and loading them into the back. Arthur ducked down in his seat, his heart pounding in his ears. He recognized the man standing by the van's open doors. It was Vincenzo, one of Dominic Rossi's top enforcers. The Rossi syndicate was packing up his sister's apartment. Panic, sharp and blinding, tore through Arthur's chest. Why would Rossi want Clara? Clara was a nobody, a nurse. She kept her head down. Then, the pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Clara walked home from Street Jude's through the alleyways. The Rossi shootout had happened downtown, but the fleeing Romano men had driven south. The little girl had slipped away. Clara found the girl. Arthur gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles cracked. Clara had found Mia Rossi, and being the bleeding heart she was, had likely marched her right up to the Rossi estate. And Dominic Rossi, a man notorious for his paranoia and ruthlessness, had locked her up to keep her quiet. Arthur watched the van pull away, leaving Clara's apartment empty. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. If Silas Romano found out that Arthur's sister had the Rossi girl, or had returned her to Rossi, Romano would torture Arthur to death, and then he would send an army to breach the Rossi estate to kill Clara just to send a message. Arthur couldn't tell the police. He couldn't tell his captain. He couldn't tell Romano. He had to get his sister out of the most heavily fortified compound in Chicago, and he had to do it alone. He pulled his service weapon from its holster, checking the magazine. He was a dirty cop who had sold his soul to the devil, but Clara was his blood, and he was going to burn the city to the ground to get her back. For 3 days, Clara Hayes lived in a state of suspended animation. The Rossi estate on the Gold Coast was a fortress of silent, lethal efficiency. Men in bespoke suits carrying concealed Berettas patrolled the manicured grounds, while inside, a small army of staff kept the massive limestone mansion immaculate. Clara's wardrobe had been entirely replaced by an unseen hand. Her cheap scrubs and worn-out jeans were gone, replaced by closets full of Loro Piana cashmere, tailored slacks, and silk blouses. It was a suffocating display of wealth and control. Dominic Rossi wasn't just keeping her alive, he was aggressively claiming ownership of her existence. She rarely saw him. Dominic left before dawn in a convoy of armored SUVs and returned long after she had retreated to her suite. The city was at war, though you wouldn't know it from the serene silence of the estate. Her only solace was Mia. The little girl had latched onto Clara with a desperate intensity. On the afternoon of the fourth day, a violent thunderstorm rolled off Lake Michigan, rattling the reinforced glass of the mansion's windows. Clara was in the vast, state-of-the-art kitchen, trying to make a simple cup of chamomile tea, when Mia bolted into the room, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. The thunder cracked like a gunshot. Mia let out a silent scream, clamping her hands over her ears and dropping to the imported marble floor. Clara didn't hesitate. Her instincts kicked in, overriding her lingering fear of her surroundings. She dropped to the floor beside the girl, pulling Mia's trembling body into her chest. "I've got you, Mia. It's just the weather. It's just a storm," Clara murmured, rocking her gently. She began to sing a soft, nonsensical lullaby she used to sing to pediatric patients at St. Jude's, rubbing slow circles on the girl's back. Minutes ticked by. The storm raged outside, but inside, Mia's breathing slowly evened out. She uncurled her fists and buried her face in Clara's cashmere sweater. "You're very good at that," Clara gasped, her head snapping up. Dominic stood in the arched doorway of the kitchen. He looked exhausted. His tie was missing, his collar was undone, and a dark bruise marred the sharp angle of his jawbone. Despite the exhaustion, his dark eyes were intensely focused on Clara, tracking the gentle way her hands moved over his sister's hair. "I'm a nurse," Clara said, her voice defensively clipped. She didn't let go of Mia. Panic attacks are standard procedure. Dominic walked fully into the kitchen. The sheer size of him made the cavernous room feel suddenly claustrophobic. He knelt beside them on the marble floor, a Mafia don ruining his expensive trousers without a second thought. He reached out and brushed a stray curl from Mia's forehead. The tenderness in his touch was so at odds with his violent reputation that it made Clara's breath hitch. "She hasn't spoken since my parents were murdered," Dominic said quietly, his gaze shifting from Mia to Clara. It was a rare, startling admission of vulnerability. "The thunder. It sounds like the gunfire from that night. I try to shield her from it, but I can't control the sky." "You can't control everything, Mr. Rossi," Clara said softly, holding his gaze despite the instinct to look away. A dark, dangerous smirk ghosted across Dominic's lips. "I disagree, Clara. I control everything that matters." He paused, his eyes dropping to her mouth before locking onto her eyes again. "And right now, that includes you." "I am not a piece of property," she fired back, her temper flaring. The fear was ebbing, replaced by a deep-seated frustration. "You bought me clothes I didn't ask for. You erased my job. But you don't own me. I stay here because I care about what happens to her, not because I'm afraid of you." It was a lie, of course. She was terrified of him. But Clara had spent years dealing with aggressive, adrenaline-fueled men in the trauma ward. She knew that showing fear was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. Dominic's eyes darkened, the amber flecks in them catching the overhead lights. He leaned in an inch closer. She could smell rain, expensive tobacco, and adrenaline on him. "You should be afraid of me, Gatina," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her skin. "Because out there in the real world, men like Silas Romano want to rip you to pieces. In here, I am the only thing standing between you and a very shallow grave. Do not mistake my hospitality for weakness." Before Clara could formulate a response, Dominic's phone vibrated violently in his pocket. He broke eye contact, his jaw clenching as he pulled it out. "Yeah," he answered, his tone instantly shifting back to ice. He listened for a moment, his expression hardening into a terrifying mask of fury. "Where? No, don't kill him. Bring him to the warehouse. I want to look him in the eyes when I break his fingers." He hung up the phone and looked down at Mia, who was now fast asleep in Clara's arms. "Put her to bed," Dominic ordered coldly, standing up and adjusting his cuffs. "And stay in your suite tonight. Lock the door." "What's happened?" Clara asked, her pulse spiking at the raw violence radiating from him. Dominic paused at the doorway, turning back to look at her. Someone is asking questions they shouldn't be asking. "A dirty cop on Romano's payroll. He was just caught trying to shake down one of my lieutenants on the west side." Clara's blood ran completely cold. A dirty cop. "What's his name?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating her reaction. "Arthur Hayes. Do you know him?" Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. She forced her face into a blank mask, fighting the wave of nausea rising in her throat. "No," She lied, her voice steady by some absolute miracle. "I don't know any cops." Dominic studied her for a long, agonizing second. "Good," he said softly, "because he's a dead man walking." Arthur Hayes was bleeding heavily from his left eyebrow, his hands zip-tied to a rusted steel chair in the center of a freezing, abandoned meatpacking plant in the West Loop. He had made a desperate, stupid mistake. He had used his police cruiser to pull over Polly, Dominic's right-hand man, hoping to leverage his badge to get information on Clara's exact location within the estate. He had underestimated how little the Rossi syndicate cared about a tin badge. Polly hadn't even rolled down his window. His men had simply rammed Arthur's cruiser, dragged him out into an alley, and beaten him unconscious. Now, Arthur sat shivering in the dark, the metallic smell of old blood and ammonia stinging his nostrils. Heavy steel doors groaned open at the far end of the warehouse. Footsteps echoed against the concrete, slow, deliberate, and expensive. Arthur looked up through a swollen eye. Two massive enforcers stepped aside, making way for Dominic Rossi. Dominic wore a long, black cashmere overcoat, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked completely at ease, which made him infinitely more terrifying. He stopped 5 feet from Arthur, looking down at the beaten detective with an expression of mild disgust. "Detective Hayes," Dominic said, his voice echoing off the damp walls. "I have to admit, I'm confused. Silas Romano usually sends smarter dogs to sniff around my territory. Pulling over my underboss in broad daylight? It's either incredibly brave or incredibly suicidal." Arthur spat a mouthful of blood onto the concrete. "I don't care about your territory, Rossi. I don't give a damn about Romano's dock contracts either." Dominic raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you harassing my men?" "Because you have something of mine," Arthur growled, straining against the heavy plastic zip ties biting into his wrists. "You took my sister." Silence fell over the warehouse. It was absolute and profound. The enforcers standing behind Dominic shifted uneasily, but Dominic stood perfectly still. Not a single muscle in his face twitched, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Your sister," Dominic repeated softly. "Clara," Arthur said, breathing heavily. "I know she found your kid. I saw your van cleaning out her apartment. She's a civilian, Rossi. She's a goddamn nurse who saves lives for a living. Let her go. Keep the kid. Keep your war with Romano. Just let Clara walk away." Dominic stepped forward, pulling his hands from his pockets. He grabbed a fistful of Arthur's blood-stained shirt, yanking the detective forward so their faces were inches apart. "Listen to me, you piece of garbage," Dominic snarled, his mask of calm completely shattered. "Your sister saved my family. Because of that, she is under my absolute protection. And right now, the biggest threat to her safety is you." Arthur flinched. "Me? I'm trying to save her." "You are on Silas Romano's payroll," Dominic roared, shaking the detective. "Do you think Romano is stupid? Do you think his lieutenants didn't notice you running around in a panic? If Romano finds out that his pet cop is related to the woman who ruined his plans, he won't just kill you, he will use you to bait her out. You have put a target on her back by existing." Arthur went pale. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He had been blinded by panic. "If she stays with me," Dominic continued, his voice dropping to a lethal, deadly calm, "she is untouchable. She has a fortress. She has an army. If she goes with you, she has a dirty, gambling-addicted cop who can't even protect himself." Dominic released Arthur, letting the chair slam back onto the concrete. "I lied to her," Dominic said smoothly, adjusting his coat. "When I asked her if she knew you earlier tonight, she looked me in the eye and swore she didn't know any cops. She lied to protect you." Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. Clara. Even terrified and trapped, she was trying to shield him. "What are you going to do to me?" Arthur asked, the fight draining out of him. Dominic looked at him, his dark eyes calculating. "If I kill you, Clara will eventually find out, and she will hate me. I cannot have that." He stepped back. "Polly." The underboss stepped forward from the shadows. "Yeah, boss? Cut him loose. Take his badge. Take his gun. Put him on a private charter out of O'Hare tonight. Send him to the safe house in Palermo, Italy." Dominic looked back at Arthur. "You are going to disappear, detective. You are going to a secure location where Romano can never find you to use against her. You will never contact her, and you will never return to Chicago. If you try to run, I won't have to kill you. Romano will do it for me. "You can't do this," Arthur protested weakly as Polly's knife sliced through his bindings. "She's my sister." "She was your sister," Dominic corrected coldly, turning his back and walking toward the heavy steel doors. "Now she is mine." 2 weeks bled into 3, and the sprawling Rossi estate on the Gold Coast transformed from a gilded cage into a bizarre, isolated sanctuary. The harsh Chicago winter raged outside, burying the city under 2 feet of snow, but inside the limestone walls, a tense, simmering domesticity took root. Clara Hayes had stopped packing her tote bag. The realization that Arthur was gone, relocated to Sicily by Dominic's hand, safe but entirely out of reach, had severed her final tie to her old life. She was a ghost to the world, legally on an indefinite leave from St. Jude's, her apartment occupied by strangers. Yet, the anger that initially consumed her had slowly mutated into something far more dangerous: understanding. She saw how Dominic Rossi operated. He was a monster to his enemies, a man who could order a hit over morning espresso, but to Mia, he was the sun and the moon, and to Clara, he was a frustrating contradiction. He provided her with everything first editions of classic novels, a grand piano she casually mentioned she used to play, and a fully stocked medical bay in the East Wing so she wouldn't lose her skills. He never forced her company, but she felt his heavy, dark gaze on her whenever they shared a room. The air between them crackled with an unspoken, electric tension that made Clara's pulse race. The illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday night. Dominic was hosting a sit-down with his capos in the grand dining room. Clara was in the second-floor library, reading by the fireplace, while Mia sat on the Persian rug, coloring quietly. The heavy mahogany door was closed, guarded by a man named Bennett, a seasoned enforcer who had been with the family for 5 years. At 9:45 p.m., the lights in the library flickered and died. Clara froze. The estate was on an independent grid. Power outages were impossible unless the primary generators and the backups were manually disabled. A chilling primal instinct seized her throat. "Mia," Clara whispered, tossing her book aside and sliding off the leather sofa. "Come here, quickly." Mia scrambled up, clutching her crayons, her wide eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fireplace. Clara pulled the little girl behind the massive oak desk in the corner of the room, her mind racing. She reached into her pocket. She didn't have a gun, but she had swiped a sterile, surgical-grade scalpel from the medical bay days ago, wrapping the blade in a piece of gauze. She unwrapped it now, the metal cold and sharp against her trembling fingers. The library door clicked open. "Miss Hayes?" It was Bennett's voice, low and urgent. "Emergency protocol. The perimeter has been breached. The boss sent me to move you and Mia to the panic room." Clara hesitated, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Something was wrong. If Dominic had sent someone, it would have been Polly. Dominic trusted Polly with his life. Furthermore, Bennett's footsteps were heavy, rushed, lacking the disciplined silence the Rossi men usually maintained. "Where is Dominic?" Clara called out, keeping her voice steady, tightening her grip on the scalpel. "He's securing the front gates," Bennett lied, stepping fully into the dark room. The moonlight catching through the window illuminated the heavy silencer attached to the barrel of his gun. Rossi men didn't use silencers inside their own home during a defense. They used them for quiet assassinations. Bennett was the mole. Silas Romano had bought his way inside. "Come out, Clara." "We don't have time," Bennett urged, moving closer to the desk. "Stay down," Clara breathed into Mia's ear, pressing the child flat against the floorboards. Clara stood up from behind the desk, keeping her hands hidden in the shadows of her cashmere cardigan. "I'm here, Bennett, but I'm not bringing Mia out until the lights are back on." "Dominic's orders." Bennett clicked his tongue, a sound of profound irritation. "Stupid girl. Romano just wants the kid to force Rossi to the table. But he told me to put a bullet in you for ruining his dock deal." He raised the weapon, pointing it directly at Clara's chest. He didn't account for the fact that Clara was an emergency room trauma nurse who spent her shifts wrestling PCP-lace gang members and restraining violent patients. She knew human anatomy, and she knew how to move when the adrenaline hit. As Bennett's finger tightened on the trigger, Clara launched a heavy, brass bookend off the desk straight at his face. Bennett ducked, the silenced gun letting out a quiet peft as a bullet tore through the air, shattering the window pane behind Clara. But the distraction was all she needed. Clara lunged forward, closing the distance between them in a second. She drove the surgical scalpel upward, sinking it deep into the soft, vulnerable space between Bennett's collarbone and his neck, the subclavian artery. Bennett let out a gurgling choke, dropping the gun as his hands flew to his neck. Blood sprayed across the expensive rug, hot and dark. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing to his knees and pitching forward onto the floor. Clara fell back against the desk, gasping for air, her hands slick with blood. She looked down at the dying man, her entire body shaking violently. She had saved lives for 7 years. Tonight, she had taken one. The library door was suddenly kicked open with enough force to splinter the wood. Dominic stood in the doorway, a tactical rifle in his hands, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying rage. He took in the scene in a fraction of a second, the shattered window, the bleeding traitor on the floor, and Clara standing over him, covered in blood, gripping a scalpel. Clara, Dominic breathed, his voice cracking, the weapon dropping to his side. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, kicking Bennett's weapon away before pulling Clara against his chest. He didn't care about the blood soaking into his tailored shirt. He crushed her to him, his large hand burying into her hair, his chest heaving. "I've got you," he rasped, pressing his lips to the crown of her head. "I swear to God, I've got you." Clara dropped the scalpel, her knees finally giving out. She buried her face in his shoulder, gripping the fabric of his shirt as a sob tore from her throat. Behind them, Mia crawled out from under the desk, running to wrap her arms around Dominic's legs. In the dark, blood-soaked library, Dominic Rossi looked down at the woman who had just killed a man to protect his sister. The last remnants of the wall between them crumbled into dust. She wasn't his prisoner. She was his queen. And Silas Romano had just signed his own death warrant. The retaliation was swift, brutal, and historic. The morning after the breach, the streets of Chicago woke up to a seismic shift in the underworld. Dominic didn't send foot soldiers to deal with Silas Romano. He went himself. Romano had retreated to his private, fortified penthouse above Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse on Rush Street, believing his wealth and political connections made him untouchable. He was wrong. By sunrise, the Romano syndicate was effectively decapitated. The police, suddenly realizing that Rossi's money and firepower vastly outweighed Romano's promises, stood down. The war was over. Won not just with bullets, but with the terrifying, calculating precision of a man who had almost lost his world. When Dominic returned to the estate late that evening, the heavy iron gates closing behind him felt like a final seal on a tomb. He walked through the grand foyer, his knuckles bruised, his dark suit smelling faintly of gun smoke and winter air. He bypassed his capos, ignored the urgent whispers of his lieutenants, and walked straight to the east wing. Clara was in the medical bay, organizing supplies with hands that still trembled slightly. She had washed the blood from her skin, but the ghost of it lingered. When she heard his heavy footsteps, she turned. Dominic stood in the doorway, looking utterly depleted. The ruthless mob boss was gone, leaving behind a man who looked like he had carried the weight of the city on his shoulders and finally dropped it. "It's done," Dominic said quietly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Romano is dead. His lieutenants have surrendered the South Side docks. The bounty is gone. No one will ever look for you or Arthur again." Clara swallowed hard, leaning against the sterile stainless steel counter. "So, I'm free?" Dominic flinched. It was a microscopic movement, but Clara saw it. He stepped into the room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows over the sharp angles of his face. He walked toward her slowly, stopping just inches away. "If you walk out those doors, Clara, I will not stop you," Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. "I will give you a new identity, millions in an offshore account, and a life far away from the blood and the violence. You can have everything you ever wanted." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, his touch impossibly tender for a man who had just dismantled an empire. "But I am a selfish man," he murmured, leaning in until his forehead rested against hers. "And if you leave, you will take my soul with you. I thought I brought you here to protect you. I didn't realize I was bringing you here to save me." Clara closed her eyes, her breath hitching. The scent of him, danger, adrenaline, and something deeply, uniquely masculine intoxicated her. She thought about her old apartment, the grueling 14-hour shifts, the profound loneliness she had masked with a busy schedule. Then she thought of Mia's soft smiles, and the fierce, absolute devotion radiating from the dangerous man standing in front of her. "You're a monster, Dominic," Clara whispered, her hands slowly coming up to rest flat against his chest, feeling the heavy, erratic thud of his heart beneath the silk shirt. "I know," he agreed softly. "You kidnapped me. You ruined my career." "I did." Clara opened her eyes, meeting his intense, burning gaze. "But if you think I'm leaving Mia, or you alone in this massive, empty house, you are out of your mind." Dominic let out a ragged breath, a sound of pure relief, and crushed his mouth to hers. The kiss was desperate, consuming, fueled by weeks of repressed tension and the lingering adrenaline of surviving the night. Clara kissed him back with equal ferocity, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. It was a promise signed in fire, binding a healer to a killer in a world where the lines between right and wrong were permanently blurred. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, a small, tentative voice echoed from the doorway. "Clara?" Dominic and Clara snapped their heads toward the sound. Standing in the hallway, clutching her porcelain doll in one hand and rubbing her sleepy eyes with the other, was Mia. Dominic froze. He slowly pulled away from Clara, dropping to his knees on the tiled floor. He looked at his little sister, tears welling in his dark, hardened eyes. He hadn't heard her voice in 2 agonizing years. "Mia," Dominic choked out, holding his arms open. Mia walked into the room, bypassing her brother to look directly at Clara. "Are you going to stay?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse, but clear as a bell. Clara felt a tear slip down her cheek. She sank to her knees beside Dominic, reaching out to take Dominic's large hand in hers before wrapping her other arm around the little girl. "I'm staying, sweetheart," Clara whispered, resting her head against Dominic's shoulder as he wrapped his massive arms around both of them. "I'm right where I belong." In the unforgiving heart of Chicago, blood is the currency of survival, but love is the ultimate act of rebellion. Clara Hayes stepped into an alley as a tired nurse and emerged as the queen of the city's most formidable syndicate. She didn't just save a lost girl, she breathed life back into a man who had long ago surrendered to the dark. The Mafia boss, who ruled with an iron fist, found himself brought to his knees by a woman armed with nothing but a medical kit and an unbreakable spirit. Their world remains one of shadows, danger, and ruthlessness, but within the fortress of the Rossi estate, a broken family was forged anew. Clara traded her scrubs for silk, and in the arms of the devil, she found the safest haven of all.